When I first read Dan Kimball's book, How Not to Read the Bible, I had no intentions of making a video series about it, but I listened to the whole thing, and at every turn, Dan Kimball is so dishonest and misleading and arguing in bad faith that I felt I had to make a video series about it. People are going to this book and looking for answers. And if you don't know what rhetoric is and how to see when somebody's using rhetoric, it might go right over your head. And even someone like myself, who's an absolute amateur at detecting rhetoric, it's so blatantly obvious in Dan Kimball's book. The first chapter of his book the first section of his book that I want to go into is his slavery apologetics. Let's get started.
What about the slavery verses in both testaments? Let's tackle the topic of slavery. There are Bible verses in the Old Testament that seem to indicate that God did not oppose slavery.
That's true.
Even more puzzling are sections of the New Testament that also speak about slavery without explicitly condemning it. We never find an "end all slavery immediately" verse in the Bible.
So Dan is an apologist, and he's correct. We never find this verse to end all slavery immediately. We never find a verse to suggest slavery should be ended at all, to even suggest that it should be ended. But he's an apologist. He gets paid to do this for a living. So I'm sure by the end of this, we will have a pretty good understanding as of why God or Jesus never said to just end all slavery.
This is a major and understandable criticism of the Bible, and whenever you hear or see verses from the Bible referring to slavery on memes or billboards, take the question very seriously. You may see verses like these in the Old
I do take it seriously. I only wish Dan Kimball did as well.
Testament. When you buy a Hebrew servant, sometimes translated.
All right, rhetoric number 1. He just snuck a word in there. And I don't know if you caught it, but by the end of this, I'm hoping that it'll be pretty obvious of what he just did. He might make one more reference to this throughout the rest of this segment, but it's 2 at most. And we'll at the end, or maybe in the middle sometime, we're going to recap of what he just did. He covered his ground without explicitly letting you know that he's covering his ground.
Slave in Exodus 21:2. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, or sometimes translated slave, Exodus 21:7. And in the New Testament, verses like, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, Ephesians 6:5.
Okay, I think he's going to pull up Exodus 21:7 first. So let's go ahead and get that up here. This is the NIV Bible. Exodus 21:7. Yeah, I think he goes into this first. So let's follow along.
Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them, Titus 2:9. In our modern context, just reading these verses makes us cringe in horror and confusion,
Yes.
seeing that they are in the Bible. We can't help but wonder if God approves of slavery. You may even feel that the Bible is evil for endorsing slavery, and sadly, we know from history that the Bible was used to defend the practice of slavery in early America. So there are good reasons to question if the Bible advocates slavery.
Okay.
Slavery is a serious topic. Our purpose is to better understand.
Slavery is a serious topic. And I wonder if Dan Kimball will ever talk about slavery.
And how to read the odd and strange parts of the Bible. So here are a few initial thoughts to help us make sense of these passages on slavery. Slavery is evil.
Yes.
Taking a person against their will and forcing them to.
Okay, so he's already started with his rhetoric number 2, taking a person against their will. This will be a common theme throughout his segment on slavery. It relies upon this.
Become the property of another is evil. We know from the Bible storyline that a result of the fall, the infection of sin causes human beings to gravitate towards ego, power, and corruption.
So basically, slavery is awful, slavery is bad, but just remember that it is your fault.
Slavery is one of the many ways human beings have strayed from God's perfect creation. God gave regulations to an existing condition people created. According to both the Old Testament and the New Testament, slavery is wrong.
I hope he gives us some verses in the Old Testament and New Testament where it explicitly says slavery is wrong, slavery is evil.
This is very important to pay attention to. We see in Exodus 21:16 a
Okay, Exodus. We're already in Exodus 21, so let's go down to 16. Okay. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession.
clear condemnation of anyone who steals someone to make them a slave.
Okay. But what about somebody who buys someone who is already a slave?
Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession.
Okay, so Dan Kimball, he has an entire section in his book. It's called Never Read a Bible Verse. And what he means by this is you can pick out lines from the Bible that sound awful, but when you look at you have to look at the broader context. You can't just take the one line. But Dan does this throughout his book whenever it benefits his argument all the time. Just like this verse. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. But if you didn't catch the word that he put in the very beginning, it was Hebrews. That's the word that's the first rhetoric that I was referring to. He snuck it in, and he doesn't bring it up again, except for maybe one other time, I don't remember. When it says anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession, what he doesn't let you know intentionally is that this is referring to Hebrews, fellow Israelites, God's chosen people. Anyone who kidnaps God's chosen people is to be put to death. And this is clearly stated up at the top of this section. Hebrew servants. These are the laws you are to set before them. And then it goes on, Exodus 21, 1 through 36. These are Hebrew laws. Are we going to get into non-Hebrew slaves, Dan? I wonder. And if you want further confirmation of this, remember, never read a Bible verse. Look at it in its whole context. So this says Hebrew servants, and that law is under the Hebrew servant law. Oops, sorry. Remember, you have to read all of the Bible. He reaffirms himself here. If someone is caught kidnapping a fellow Israelite or treating them or selling them as a slave, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. So here we have two confirmations. One, explicitly saying if you kidnap a fellow Israelite, Hebrew, the kidnapper must die. But then you go back to Exodus 21. And you can see that these are the laws you are to set before them being Hebrew servants. So what about if you kidnap someone who is not a Hebrew, Dan? Are we going to get into it?
And in the New Testament, in 1 Timothy 1, 9 and 10, it says, "The law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine." The assumption in both Old and New Testaments is that slave trading is evil and is condemned in the Bible itself.
No, it's not. Kidnapping your fellow Hebrew slaves is condemned. I will grant you that. Show me the passage where buying or kidnapping or anything to a non-Hebrew slave, a non-Israelite, is condemned. I'm sure we'll get into it, right?
So why are there verses about slavery that seem to suggest God allows it? To understand this, we
Because he does. It's that simple. You don't need an entire book on apologetics because he does allow it.
need to return to the culture and context of the ancient world and remember
This is an important part. The culture and context. Remember that.
that God didn't create the institution of
God didn't create the institution
slavery.
of slavery. Nobody says that he did. I don't know why he's bringing this up. It's not an argument anybody makes. Have you ever once heard an atheist or somebody from a different religion saying, well, God created slavery in the first place? I haven't. Weird to bring up.
Nor did he ever command or direct people to have slaves.
Yes, he did. I'm sure we'll go over those passages though, right, Dan?
What we see in the Bible is God giving instructions to regulate a pre-existing way of life that was pervasive at that time.
Dan, in an earlier section of your book, Genesis, I think it's titled "In the Beginning We Got It Wrong," something like that. You say that the story of Exodus, well, the story of Genesis was written based on the story of Exodus. The Hebrews are escaping Egypt after being enslaved for roughly 400 years. And they have no idea who they are or what their God is or anything. So God is writing to them to let them know all this stuff. What you're telling me is that in the story of the Exodus, when God is telling people what laws to have, he has a clean slate. He has a people who have no idea what they should do, how they should follow God, who their God is, or who they are, where they came from. He has a clean slate. And then directly after the 10 Commandments of Exodus 20, telling them, thou shalt not kill, don't lie, don't steal, don't have any witnesses, don't bear false witness, this and that. The very next chapter, he's giving them the rules for Hebrew slavery. The Hebrews didn't have this already. What condition is being improved upon? They just escaped 400 years of slavery. So they don't have, within their own culture, the Hebrew culture, they don't have a system of slavery yet. And you give it to them in page 2 of the Exodus. So you can say that these rules were set forth to improve upon existing conditions, but show me what the existing conditions were for the Hebrews who just escaped Egypt. Did they escape Egypt already having enslaved themselves to themselves?
Slavery was everywhere in the ancient world, embedded in the economic and social institutions of those times.
Yes, so God has the perfect opportunity right now to tell his people, God's chosen people, the Hebrews, the Jews, the Israelites, do not own other people. But he doesn't do that for fear of what? Economic collapse? They were slaves for 400 years. They didn't have an economy. There was no downside for God to tell his people, not the other people. We'll take them out of it. For God to tell his people right here, right now. He could have set an absolutely revolutionary method or view on slavery, but he didn't. He just tells them how they can own people.
God did not affirm or endorse slavery,
He clearly endorsed slavery when he gives them the rules about slavery that they didn't even have in the first place.
but worked within the cultural framework of that time to begin a longer process of transformation that would lead to moving people out of slavery.
A longer process of transformation that will move people out of slavery. This was written approximately 1400 BC. Slavery was officially abolished in the 1800s. So, yes, I agree with you, Dan. It was a very, very slow transition out of slavery. 3,000 years, and the best we got is most of the world, the majority of the world condemns slavery. 3,000 years, this is the best we could do? Come on.
In any and every form. It's important to remember that after the fall, see the timetable chart in the Chapter 3 section of the accompanying PDF.
It's important to remember that this is all your fault.
Human beings began developing all kinds of practices that God did not intend in his original creation. Human beings, not God, developed slavery.
That's the second time you've brought that up. Nobody's making that claim, man.
To see God's original design for human beings before humans messed it up, we need to only look at the beginning.
Just remember that it's your fault.
The creation in the Garden of Eden. Jesus modeled this for us when he asked about marriage and divorce. He sent those asking questions back to the beginning to remind them of how God had originally created people before human beings rebelled against God and altered God's original setup.
We got it, man. It's our fault.
The same is true with slavery. God did not create slavery.
Third time. Nobody. Okay.
And what we find in the Bible is a process in which God is slowly moving people back toward a standard of greater respect and dignity for all people, not less.
Very, very slowly.
I'll give you some examples of what I mean by this.
Okay.
But keep this key idea in mind. God is not the originator of slavery.
Point number 4. God did not create slavery. 4 times. Nobody says this. Why are you bringing it up?
Slavery in our culture is not the same as in the Bible.
Is it?
Here is the key point on slavery for our purposes. In general, when we think of slavery, we think of the evils of the New World, race-based chattel slavery, and the Atlantic.
I don't. I think of slavery as when one person owns another person. That's it. Full stop. This is another point of rhetoric. Dan needs to put this in your mind. He needs you to think about race-based transatlantic slavery for his spiel to make sense. He's putting this in your head early on because he needs you to think about slavery this way.
Slave trade with the American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, which led to the Civil War. This form of slavery involved kidnapping and forced labor.
So remember earlier when almost one of the first things he brought up was that kidnappers should be put to death? That's why he did it, because he was going to bring this up later on to let you know that God condemned kidnapping And then he says the American colonies, the transatlantic slave trade, was kidnapping. So clearly God didn't approve of that because that was kidnapping. But come on. You think that all of the slaves were kidnapped? No.
It was evil.
Yes.
This type of slavery, however, while it did exist in ancient times, was not the
Are we going to talk about that kind of slavery, Dan?
common and predominant form of slavery. Knowing this makes a significant difference in how we read the Bible verses about slavery. Here
No, it doesn't.
are some of the differences.
Okay, let's go into them.
Slaves who lived at the time of Moses were more like servants or bondservants.
No. Hebrew slaves who lived at the time of Moses were more like servants or bondservants.
In modern translations of the Bible, the English word slave is not always used. Many translations use the word servant. The two situations were very different.
Yes, they were. So let's talk about both. I'm sure we will.
In ancient Israel, it was common to sell yourself to pay a debt or escape poverty. It is difficult for us to comprehend this way of thinking, but it was quite common back then for the poor to sell themselves to escape poverty or pay a debt. When you sold yourself to someone as a servant, it meant that your basic needs would be covered. And while there was an owner-servant relationship,
I just want to butt in real quick. Keep in mind, everything he's talking about is for your fellow Israelite, the Israelite to Israelite relationship.
it was not identical with the race-based slavery that began with kidnapping.
Did it begin with kidnapping?
With verses like Exodus 21:7, if a
Okay,
man sells his
21:7.
daughter as a servant, sometimes translated slave, our framework has to shift from what we initially think of today to what it was like back at that time.
Oh, Dan, I hope you get into the rest of this. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, you miss the rest of that passage where it says she is not to go free as male servants do. You see, when an Israelite has a fellow Israelite as a slave or servant, whatever, every 6 years, you got to let them go. Unless you're a woman, there's different rules for you. We'll get into them.
Selling your daughter would be incredibly wicked to us today, and I'm not justifying it or endorsing it, but this was how things commonly functioned in that world, and God gives these instructions to.
So the Israelites who were freshly freed after 400 years of slavery from Egypt, this is what was common in their culture for them to sell themselves to themselves. Give me some. Back that up.
Reinforce and protect people in that context, as hard as that is.
Dan, this is the first time I have to say this. Your apologetics are disgusting. To protect people. Give me a break.
Is for us to grasp today. In this situation, it is highly likely the father is selling his daughter because he.
There's a modifying word there. Highly likely. But what about when it's a different situation than what you're about to describe? I'm sure we'll get into it.
He does not want her to starve or be abandoned. In that day, options were limited, and it was often a choice between life and death.
Okay. So just take a moment and ask yourself, and I won't get into this too much because it's disgusting. But he says you can sell your daughter so she doesn't starve or live in poverty, whatever. What about your son? Are you allowed to sell your son in this way? Why would it just... I'll leave it up to your imagination as to why somebody would want to buy a daughter. And I'll leave it up to your imagination what the age of consent was back in these times. Or you can look it up.
So when the Bible gives guidance to a father about selling his daughter into servitude, the Bible is not saying this is a good thing to do. It is recognizing that if a father were to find himself in a place where this was necessary,
No, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say if a father must sell his daughter because it's necessary. It says if a man sells his daughter. Nowhere in here does it say if it's necessary. Was that common? Maybe it was necessary. Well, sure, but then why aren't you selling your sons?
for reasons all too common at that time, he should do it in a way that protects her and
Do it in a way that protects her. I'm sure we'll get into how it protects her.
preserves her dignity. Reading the entire chapter where this verse is found, we see an attempt to flesh out ways of protecting those who were in bondservant arrangements. For a father, if he had to sell his daughter as a slave to protect her or provide for her, he could not sell her to be given as a prostitute for physical pleasure.
He couldn't sell her as a prostitute. No. It doesn't say that he could. But what it does say is that he can sell her to a person to be their wife. So I think it's a little bit worse because at least the prostitute would be getting paid. She just has to do all of the womanly duties of the time for free.
She could not be disposed of as a piece of property the new owner no longer desired. He must treat her like a family member.
That's some very poetic language there, Dan. He must treat her like a family member because he knows exactly what you currently think of as a family member. But it doesn't say that. It says he must treat her as a wife. And imagine what being a wife was like at that time.
And if marriage is not a possibility in the future, she must eventually be set free.
Unless he gives her to his son. He can also do that. So this is what Dan Kimball tries to says is to set up to protect her dignity. The daughter gets sold into servitude. We'll say servitude. I'll go with it. She doesn't please him. He can kick her out of the house. Where's the dignity at? How did it protect her? I'll give it to him. If she pleases him, it'll protect her. He has to give her food and clothes and marital rights. Use your imagination what women's marital rights were at the time. But if she doesn't please him, he can just boot her out the door. How is this protecting her dignity, Dan?
I understand that all this sounds extremely wacky and horribly primitive to our way
Wacky and primitive. No, Dan, it's not wacky and primitive. It's disgusting.
of thinking and in our culture today. Arranged marriages strike us as inherently wicked and unfair, but this was the norm in the ancient world. And in the context of this verse, the Bible's command is a move toward reinforcing protections for the daughter in that system, and not a blanket endorsement of the system.
Mm-hmm.
This was also a different form of slavery, often
it was a different form of slavery, Dan. When are we going to talk about the other form?
temporarily done for the sake of survival, or even to
Temporarily done. Back that up.
advance oneself out of poverty. We must reframe what we read through that lens, taking into consideration
No. You must reframe what you read. I think it's disgusting. You have to reframe it to make it a little bit less disgusting.
the world they lived in, where people were selling themselves to serve others and arranging marriages all the time. This wasn't bizarre then.
Selling themselves, arranged marriages. When are we going to talk about slavery?
If anything, it was a way of protecting people caught up in the effects of fallout from human sin.
Just remember that it's your fault.
Keep in mind that God commanded the death penalty for those who kidnapped people and made them slaves.
God commanded the death penalty for those Israelites who kidnapped fellow Israelites and made them slaves.
Read Exodus 21:16 and 1 Timothy 1:10.
Exodus 21:16. Oh yeah, we went over this. Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. I'm sure this applies to all kidnapping, right? Or does it apply to Hebrews? I don't know.
Although this type of slavery did happen at times, we never see God endorsing or teaching people to do this. Instead, we see God condemning it. And when we do find slavery being addressed in the Bible, it is generally speaking about the type of slavery that existed to help the poor survive in the ancient world.
There's another modifier, generally. So he could say, when we read passages about slavery in the Bible, it's talking about the type of slavery that is indentured, selling yourself to get out of poverty. But he doesn't say that. He says, generally, it's done this way. But what about when it's not? I'm sure we'll get into it.
Forms of slavery that were established for people to work off debt. Leviticus 25:39, for example.
Leviticus 25:39, let's bring that up. So Dan references Leviticus here, so clearly he's read Leviticus, right? Leviticus 25:39. If any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. All right, great. You can own them and you can beat them, and you can treat them relatively awfully. You can't kill them. You can't kidnap them. But here's the word again. Israelites. Are we going to talk about non-Israelites? I'm sure we'll get into it.
When we look at slavery in the context of the ancient world, we need to deprogram our normal definition and redefine it according to what it meant in that world.
No, you need to program it, reprogram it, and redefine it in that world. I say it's disgusting. Oh, yeah, let's go. I mean, this is Exodus 20, when God gives the people the laws, the 10 Commandments. They don't have any of this stuff before. The very next chapter is Exodus 21, where the rules are given for slaves. The very next chapter. This is the law that was given to them by God. Exodus 20 and 21.
New Testament slavery was common. Even 30% of the population were slaves.
Okay, Dan, you gave the spiel just a little bit earlier about how this is just moving people away from slavery. So 1,400 years later, 30% of the world is still slaves.
I understand that slavery in New Testament times is a world we cannot imagine and have trouble understanding. But these slaves could serve as doctors and lawyers. They could go to school and be educated. This was a different cultural context with more than 30% of the population in the New Testament Roman and Greek world living as slaves, or what today we might call servants.
Mm-hmm.
When we read Bible verses about slaves or servants in the New Testament, we have to look at what is being said through the lens of the culture at that time, which is not identical with the slavery we think of today. Slavery was not race-based the way we think of it today.
Who says it is? Just ask yourself, how many times have you heard that the ancient Israelites didn't like black people and kept them as slaves? I've never made this argument.
Today, when we think of the slave trade, it brings to mind the unjust enslavement of African people. That
No, it doesn't. It brings to mind one person owning another person. You need us to think of it this way.
type of slavery was race based. However,
Okay.
in ancient Israel or in the time of the New Testament, you
Hmm.
would not typically notice a racial
Another modifier word you would not typically.
difference between those serving as slaves and those who weren't slaves. When you look at the Old Testament, you find Israelites who had fellow Israelites as slaves.
Okay, there's the second part where he does slip this in. But what about non-Israelites, Dan? I'm sure we'll get into it.
For a limited time. In New Testament times, you would find Romans and Greeks of the same race and ethnicity having Roman and Greek slaves. Back then, slavery was not race based as slavery was in the United States.
Yeah, modern concept of racism is just that, modern. We get it. Are there people out there who think that the Israelites were just racist against black people?
Though it might not sound like it, the Bible brought positive changes to ancient slavery.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't living in a culture where it is normal for people to sell themselves or sell family members to others to pay off debt.
I'm glad you covered that form of Hebrew servitude to other Hebrews. But what about when it's not? I'm sure we'll get into it.
Or avoid the ravages of poverty. That's one reason why this is difficult for us to imagine or accept. As we have seen, the Bible explains how human beings, in their rebellion, changed God's original creation plans.
Just remember that it's your fault.
It's clear that humans established slavery, not God.
Okay, number 5. 5 times you feel the need to bring up that God didn't create slavery, a point that nobody is making. I don't understand why you keep bringing this up.
He was not establishing slavery or endorsing it. He was giving
6 times?
regulations to limit the evil that would spread from what humans had done. God was seeking better treatment for slaves in Israel than they would have received in the surrounding cultures outside.
He was seeking better treatment for slaves in Israel who were also Israelite slaves. What about when they weren't? Please get into it.
Of Israel. Leviticus 25:43 says, "Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God." When we read Bible verses about slavery, they are offering guidance, but the
Dan, your apologetics are disgusting. Just remember, never read a Bible verse. So let's not just read a Bible verse, Dan. Let's look at that. Leviticus. Let's see what it says. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear thy God. Leviticus 25, they say? Okay. This is what I'm talking about when I say you gotta listen for the rhetoric in Dan's speeches. In all apologetics, you gotta listen for it. He has the whole chapter on how to never read a Bible verse and look at it in its broader context. But Dan knows the broader context. Now he gives you the Leviticus 25:42, but he intentionally leaves out that when God says, "Do not rule over them ruthlessly," he's talking about fellow Israelites. He says that it's not race-based chattel slavery. This is rhetoric. He's doing this intentionally because he's right. It wasn't race-based chattel slavery. He needs you to focus on the race-based. He goes in multiple times about how it's not race-based because that's a point he can defend. So anytime he says chattel slavery, it's caveated with race-based. So let's look up real quick chattel. The meaning of chattel. A slave, a bondman, an item of tangible, movable, or immovable property, except real estate and things such as buildings. Okay. A personal possession. He treated his wife little more than a chattel, goods and chattel. A personal possession. Chattel. He needs you to focus on the race based because he can defend that. He never says chattel slavery because he can't defend that. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean. From his verse, Leviticus. Never read a Bible verse. Do not rule over them ruthlessly. 25:42. Okay? 25:42. He's right. Because the Israelites are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. 25:43. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. But he leaves out the broader context. Because they are because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and they will become your property. You can give them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Now, you can ask yourself, did Dan say, do not rule over them ruthlessly, to put it into your mind that God was talking about all slaves? Did he intentionally leave out the rest of that verse? Did he read a Bible verse? I would say yes.
This guidance was always intended to improve what already existed. Here are two quick examples. 1. Killing a slave merited punishment. Exodus 21:20. 2.
Exodus 21:20, Hebrew slave.
2. Permanently injured slaves had to be set free. Exodus 21,
Permanently injured Hebrew slaves.
26 and 27. These biblical directions deviated significantly from the normal treatment of slaves at that time, part of God's process of gradually moving people toward a more dignified relationship between a slave and the household the slave served. In the New Testament, we see God moving the people away from slavery.
1,400
we
years
see
later.
the seeds of a movement, the church, that would equalize the worth of both slave and free people. Paul the Apostle writes a letter to a slave owner named Philemon concerning a slave named Onesimus.
I'm sure Paul explicitly condemns slavery.
Who had run away from Philemon. Onesimus met Paul while Paul was in prison and had become a Christian during this time. Paul was sending Onesimus back to Philemon, and in the letter we read some amazing, radical, countercultural things. Paul asks Philemon to not just take Onesimus back after running away and stealing money from his master, but to receive him no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me.
So Paul, there was a slave that Paul knew, and he became friends with him. Okay.
But even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. What makes this so unusual for that time is that Paul does not want Philemon to punish Onesimus even more. He is telling him that Onesimus is now his brother in the Lord.
So Paul said he befriends somebody and says, "Hey, can you stop punishing this guy?" He's a fellow Christian. Therefore, Paul wants to end all slavery.
Promises to personally pay for any of the damages Onesimus is.
Does this letter from Paul does this apply to all slaves, or just this one guy who's his fellow brother in Christ?
Escape and absence may have cost Philemon. Paul stops short of explicitly ordering Philemon to free Onesimus.
He does stop short, doesn't he?
But in every other way, he implies it. He makes it clear that Onesimus should be treated as a brother in Christ and
Onesimus or all slaves?
expresses a wish that Onesimus would have the freedom available to him to help in Paul's ministry.
Okay. He wants another a fellow proselytizer.
In other places in the New Testament, we see a clear leveling of the divide between slave and non-slave, treating them as equals. Galatians 3:28.
In the beginning, he gave the spiel about obey your masters, especially the cruel ones. Obey your masters basically is repeated a couple of times throughout there. So I'm sure he'll get back to those and what they must have meant by that.
It says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus."
Mm-hmm.
In a world where at least 30% of the population were slaves, this was extremely forward-thinking. It was nothing less than revolutionary. God is consistently seeking to move people.
1,400 years later, and the best we could get is, hey, maybe slaves should be thought of as children of God as well. Don't free them, but just think of them as your brothers in Christ. Okay.
People away from the effects of the fall and reaffirming the original truth of our creation, that all human beings are created in His image and are equal. There was to be no male patriarchy or misogyny. More on this in the next chapter.
You will get into it.
No ethnic hierarchies or racism. No difference of worth between slaves and non-slaves. God is laying the groundwork to change how human beings.
Now, mind you, when he says no difference between slaves and non-slaves, what he means is in the eyes of God. Not that we should make laws to enforce this. He just means that in the eyes of Jesus, I should say, in the eyes of Jesus, there's no difference between these two people. So, should we free them? Well, no. Slaves still obey your masters. Let's be clear about that. But God finds you as equal, or Jesus finds you equals. That's good.
See each other. He is helping people blinded by the virus of sin and selfishness to see other people again, to look beyond financial status, wealth or poverty, skin color or education, to see that everyone is equal.
Everyone is equal. What he means by this is not under the law, but in Christ's eyes, in Jesus' eyes. But I'm just going to go off on a very quick side tangent, and I'm going to see if Dan Kimball believes that everyone is equal. Equal meaning no different treatment among one group of people from another group of people. And I always ask myself, especially in today's context, what about, I'll just ask the question blatantly, if they're equal, does God recognize gay marriage? And this is a side point, but I think it's important because Dan just gave this whole thing about equality. So you look at Sean McDowell. Sean McDowell gave the foreword to this book. Tim Mackey has the podcast, who also references this book. And they both say, no, a gay couple cannot be married in God's eyes. Well, what is that? That's not equality, man. What does Dan Kimball have to say about it? Well, I had a hard time finding what Dan Kimball had to say about it, but I think when you have Sean McDowell and Tim Mackey who support this book, and Sean McDowell giving the forward to this book, that saying no, people are not married, cannot be married in the eyes of God. I would assume that Dan Kimball feels the same way. Where is the equality there? Why do I feel that Dan Kimball feels the same way? Well, because when I was trying to look up his views on gay marriage, I noticed something very, very funny. Dan Kimball's title for his book is Making Sense of Shrimp, the Skin of a Dead Pig. I can't read the rest of the title. Give me just a moment here. Shrimp. Oh, you know what? I'll pull up the chapter title real quick. You can compare the differences between the two. Okay. The title of the book is Stranger Things. Shrimp, Slavery, and the Skin of a Dead Pig. And then the sub section is Making Sense of Shrimp, the Skin of a Dead Pig, and Slavery. But you notice this post from Dan Kimball, 2014, homosexuality, polygamy, slavery, shrimp. Why did you choose to leave this one out, Dan? You can make apologetics for rape, for slavery, for the genocide, but you still in 2023 can't come up with the apologetics for homosexuality. This was the original title. Why did you move it out? We're all equal, right? We'll keep going.
When this shift of thinking begins to penetrate the hearts and minds of the followers of Jesus, it leads to tectonic shifts in cultures around the world.
Tectonic shifts. Yes, I will agree. Tectonic. Because of how slow the plates of the earth move, that's about how slow the shift moved. Tectonic is a great way to say it. 3,000 500, we'll say, okay, 3,000 years later, and we still have slavery. Thanks a lot.
And it begins here, with God wanting his people to experience how God actually sees them as his image bearers. It was wrong to use the Bible to justify slavery in America.
Well, yes, it was, but it was perfectly allowed.
Those who use the Bible to support race-based slavery in the United States.
There's the race-based again. Those who use the Bible to support race-based slavery. Well, okay, yeah, fine. But what about those who use the Bible to support chattel slavery?
States were seeking to justify an evil and wicked practice. They did not use correct or intelligent Bible study methods. They didn't ask questions about the original audience or study the culture of the original readers. Not all Christians agreed with these readings of the Bible at that time. Many Christians fought against slavery and condemned the incorrect usage of the Bible in this way.
That's
Christians
true.
such as Wilberforce and many others fought against slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Today, many
So did non-Christians. So what?
Christian organizations and churches are fighting against modern trafficking.
Well, that's good.
Yes, there were Christians who used
Except the Catholic Church.
the Bible to back slavery. That was clearly wrong and evil.
Was it clearly wrong and evil when it explicitly says your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you? From them you may buy slaves. They will become your property. You can give them to your children and make them slaves for life. I'm sure he'll get into it.
Bible study methods are important. Looking at Bible verses through the lens of the entire storyline of the Bible.
But you didn't do that. You picked this little one verse here. Do not rule over them ruthlessly. But you never mentioned that this is speaking about Israelites. Never in this whole segment does he talk about slavery, because he can't. He only talks about the Hebrew laws given to Hebrew servants. He doesn't talk about this form of slavery. I wonder why.
You cannot conclude that God endorses slavery.
From them you may buy slaves. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. You have your Israelites, who are the indentured servitudes. You have your slaves, who are not Israelites. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may buy slaves. Yeah, he didn't endorse it.
Why don't Jesus and the Bible writers just say, end all slavery?
Oh, okay. That's the question from the very beginning. Yeah, let's get into it. I'm excited about this.
We can't know why Jesus didn't just say, no more slavery. We don't know why he didn't address this practice or the hundreds of other evils in the world. Some have surmised that because more than 30% of the population were slaves, it could have led to economic upheaval and likely more poverty and starvation.
But the freedom of slaves, could you have made this argument? Okay, hold on. Let's take it back. Just take it back a minute. The South was heavily dependent on slaves for their economy. Could you have made that argument for them, Dan? Because that's what you're doing. You're saying we shouldn't have freed the slaves. Now, mind you, it wasn't a gradual transition to freedom. It was a war, and then they were free. Are you going to make this argument for the American slavery, the transatlantic slavery? Come on, man.
In general, Jesus did not focus on specific civil laws or governments, but addressed the desires and motives of the human heart.
Mm-hmm.
I'll admit it would have made things a lot easier if Jesus or Paul had just said, all slaves go free. But
yes, it would have. And what about your argument just a minute ago when you said that it would have led to starvation and all types of awful things? And now you're explicitly saying it would have made things a lot easier. Yes, it would have made things a lot easier, but you have to come up with these apologetics.
But they didn't, and there must have been reasons, but we don't see those given in the Bible.
How unfortunate.
What we do find in the Bible is the progression of instruction. The Old Testament gave guidance to protect slaves and give them more dignity.
Now, there he goes again with his dishonest rhetoric. He never talks about slaves. He talks about Israelite slaves.
This made Israel distinct from other nations. The New Testament moves one step farther, declaring that regardless of whether one is the slave or the one the slave serves,
you should be freed if you're a slave.
They are equals, brothers and sisters in Jesus.
Okay, well, hey, he admits it. Regardless of whether you're a slave or whatever, you're equals in Jesus, not in law. Well, thank you.
Two foundational ideas guide this progression. The first is that God originally created us in his image, and all human beings have value and worth because of this.
Mm-hmm.
The second is that in the new covenant, all those who follow Jesus are now part of the same family, brothers and sisters, and this takes priority over all social, economic, racial, and gender distinctions.
Social and economic? Didn't you just say that one of the reasons they may not have freed the slaves were for economic reasons? Clearly, it doesn't take precedence.
The Bible lays the foundation that frees people from the evil practice of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
but this change occurs slowly over time through the
Thousands of years and we're still not done? Yes, very slowly over time.
heart instead of the social change through governmental power and laws.
You mean the way that actually works?
However, when the heart changes, social change inevitably follows.
Mm-hmm.
When isolated verses are used to claim God and the Bible are evil,
You did the isolated verses, Dan. Never read a Bible verse.
those saying this aren't looking beyond the surface.
Just like you did when you gave this, do not rule over them ruthlessly, to clearly imply he's talking about all slaves. But the passages just before it and just after it are making it very clear that when he says do not rule over them ruthlessly, he's talking about your fellow Israelites.
A summary of shrimp, pigskins, and slavery.
Okay, well, I think we'll end it there. Um, I'm going to go into further chapters in this book, but I just want to end it with this. If you have to be misleading, deceptive, and dishonest just to try to justify somehow in your head that slavery was somehow okay, and then never speak about slavery as we know it, the slavery as we know it existed back then, but Dan doesn't touch on that kind of slavery. He's misleading. I can say, as an atheist, that God was disgusting for handing down these rules. Can you say the same? Are you barred from saying the same?